This happened to me a few years ago, in springtime. I was geocaching by myself as I usually do. I had chosen one that was along a long abandoned and ripped out railway near some residences and a converted factory. Basically, this pathway ran between the two of them. It was still pretty wooded and you couldn't see the houses or that much of the factory from the path. I found the cache and signed it, cleaned it up a bit and put it back. It was a pretty bright late spring day, maybe late April or early May. As I stepped from the bushy area the cache was in back onto the path, I looked to my right, where I had come from, and I saw a man coming. He was carrying a rifle and was about 200 feet away. Luckily, he was looking off into the side and did not see me, so I stepped back off the path and around a large bush, commonly known as a birdberry, a very dense growth habit that the cache was hidden behind. I was at this point about 15 to 20 feet away from the path. I waited, and I watched the area of the path I could see. He walked by from right to left, not fast or slow, just walking. He held the rifle in his left hand. He did not see me because I was somewhat behind the bush in the back. I waited what I felt like was long enough to let him get his ways down the path before cautiously emerging. I looked in the direction he had gone to assure he was no longer in sight and started running in the opposite direction to my car. I know it was definitely not any type of hunting season because my ex was a hunter, so I know when they are. Plus, it was far too close to the houses to shoot a firearm. It hasn't stopped me from catching alone though, but I'm definitely more careful when I do. This happened when I was growing up around 2004-2005, when I was around 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then, and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on its way anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres down outside of that area, and he was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but it also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours of my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfortable. I hated it. All I had to do was either stare out the window or try to beat my Super Mario Land 2 in my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth. The drive took most of the day, so we ended up getting there early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin and the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I'd been scouts for a couple years and spent a lot of free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. So after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough. Dust and dirt everywhere. Flies. I remember that it looked like some of the raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, and then setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. Something about that night was just weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep, for any restful amount. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guess was maybe an hour or so. When we woke up, it was early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout out the land for tracks and signs of hogs, and find a good place to set up blind. It was a summer and horribly hot in the afternoon, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came across an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn up grounds where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for some more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by the trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got the lease that nobody was up there. Not to mention the gate was locked up when we arrived. The person was wearing some bright colored red jacket. We slowly walked towards them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all. Dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pocket. Weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and would look to be ski pants. Now this is Texas in the summer. It was about 98 outside by then. My dad called out again. No reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unstrap the clip to his pistol holster. That's all we had at the time since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay put about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down, watched him circle around the front of the man, all while talking to him, asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the front of the man, and my dad stood up straight with a confused look on his face. I called out saying, "What's wrong?" And he called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it and my dad stood there, staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing was brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of it being outside for more than a day at most. At that moment I looked at my dad, and I could see him get worried. Almost immediately after that, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember suddenly feeling so scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back, while I was trying to hold back my panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was so terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but in reality it was only 45 minutes. After returning, we packed up and left immediately. We drove back home that very same day, and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was so confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had an issue with people because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't paranormal, but me being young, and at least possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked. My dad wasn't able to sleep that night either. He had that same feeling but didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week, he got a call from his buddy, and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone, no mannequin or anything or anyone. This story still makes my hair stand on end. I've got no idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap or something. It's not the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me in the woods, but definitely my top 3. One day last year, I was hunting in a ground blind on the outskirts of a field, about 20 yards from a stream. On the other side of the creek was a massive uphill slope, completely covered in trees. We call this area the Thicket. This property is roughly 2 hours northeast of Atlanta, Georgia. This particular day wasn't very active. Had been in a blind for about half an hour and hadn't seen a deer yet. I heard something walking slowly down the hill behind me, about my 4 or 5 o'clock, and just stopped right about the time it gets to the creek. It sounds heavy as it walks, so I'm expecting to see a deer, as there aren't really any other good-sized animals in the area. There have been bears sighted on the small road the property lays on, but it's always a big local story, and I've been living here for 30 plus years and never seen one. It's quiet for a minute, then all of a sudden, I feel something hit the top of the blind, about the size of an acorn maybe. I'm under a small tree, so I don't think much of it, but after about 30 seconds, it happens again. The nature of this occurrence leads me to believe that something didn't fall on the blind. Something was thrown at it. Now is about the time I started asking questions. I didn't have many to ask though, before it stepped back into the creek. I can hear water splashing around as confirmation just how big and heavy this thing is. Whatever it is. I finally work up the courage to stand up in the blind and look out the back window flap to see if I can see my assailant. But there's nothing there, and no noises have stopped. I sit back down, wondering what the hell is going on behind me, and start getting a tad bit unnerved. That's when I hear it grunting. It makes these concerning vocalizations and once again starts stomping around the creek. When I hunt, I'm usually carrying a buck knife, a 9mm handgun, and my primary rifle, which is a Browning X-Bolt chambered in a .300 short magnum. For anyone who doesn't understand what that means, it is a massively unreasonable powerful bullet. Most deer I hunt never run away. It's just a hair short of being considered overkill. The reason why I tell you this is to highlight the fact that I wasn't exactly defenseless at the time. Quite the opposite. After about 2 to 3 more minutes of hearing this thing cause a ruckus in the creek, I decided my only way out was a confrontation. I stand up, unzip my blind, and take the safety off my shoulder cannon as I step onto the open field. But again, it's just not there. Nothing in the creek, nothing in the field, nothing in the thicket. No sounds of any kind. Nothing. I've had about all I can stand at this point. I don't care how many guns I have. Nothing that big and heavy can just vanish into thin air. It was time to get back in my RTV and get the hell out of there, and now. But I couldn't even take one step in the direction of my ride when I hear it again, walking slowly back up the hill, deep into the thicket. I swear this time, I think I can hear it breathing too. I haven't hunted that field again, and I never plan to.